Welcome to Order from Ashes, the Century Foundation's International Affairs podcast. Today, we're going to talk about U.S. aid to Syria with two people intimately familiar with the issue. We have Daphne McCurdy, who has run American aid programs in Syria and is now working as an analyst in the United States, and Sam Heller, an independent researcher based in Beirut, who's been also following the conflict in Syria since it began. Thank you two for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks. Excited to be on.
Daphne, you have recently published a report at the Century Foundation about how to help Syria without helping Assad. And I want to ask you, what is your main contention about what kind of aid the United States should give this country that it just spent upward of nearly a decade trying to change the regime of and involved in a war against the sitting president?
Yeah, so thanks, Thanassis. So the United States has a rather extreme position when it comes to economic assistance in regime-held Syria. So on the one hand, we have this policy of maximum pressure and economic coercion based primarily on a expansive sanctions regime and the withholding of reconstruction assistance. On the other end, we are the single largest donor of humanitarian assistance to Syria, and that assistance includes about a third going to regime-held areas. And so
that's a little known fact, by the way, especially to critics of U.S. policy in Syria. They focus a lot on the military aid to rebels and often seem unaware of the huge humanitarian contribution.
Right. That's absolutely right. And this is something that U.S. policymakers like Special Representative James Jeffrey like to point to, that while we are trying to target the murderous regime of Assad, we still support the people of Syria, and we do that through humanitarian assistance. Now, the problem with that, I think, is that humanitarian assistance, as it currently stands, is really skewed towards an emergency response. So this is, food baskets, shelter, water deliveries through water trucks, really sort of things that are intended to be short term. But now that we are 9 years into a civil war, really doesn't make sense to continue in the long term. And so what I argue in this piece is that we need to start thinking about something that is certainly very short of reconstruction assistance to regime-held areas of Syria, but also something that goes beyond the emergency response humanitarian assistance that we're providing to the country. The challenge, of course, is that the Syrian regime has, up to this point, co-opted most of humanitarian aid going to the country. And so to do this work would require us to really rethink the entire humanitarian assistance paradigm that currently exists in Syria.
But just starting with this kind of minimal emergency aid or stabilization aid that falls short of reconstruction. I want to ask both of you, because you've both been very intimately familiar with every twist and turn of the last 9 years. Why should the U.S. give any aid at all at this stage, with its partners or the sides it's supporting having effectively lost, either completely lost or about to lose the war? Why be involved even to the scope of $1?
Well, sure. So I think that's a really good question, Thanassis, and I think actually you're seeing increasingly in Washington and on Capitol Hill, people arguing even that we should cut off even humanitarian assistance to Syria at this point, given the way that the regime has co-opted it. I think that the reasons we should provide it there's both strategic and moral reasons. On the moral reasons, I would say, after 9 years of war and a regime that has just brutalized its citizenry, we as a moral leader in the world, if one can argue that we still are that, have a responsibility to help the people of Syria who are not to blame for the government's egregious abuses. And then on a more strategic level, I think there's a compelling argument to be made that it is not in the U.S. interest to have a country that is such a key to stability in the Middle East to continue to be destabilizing the region and a haven potentially for terrorists and other sorts of instability.
Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that sounds about right. I mean, this is a country with whose government, the United States is enemies, but whose people are mostly blameless, and then who are in urgent need, particularly now. After certainly over the course of this war, but then now as the country's economic situation has deteriorated sharply, then I think that many more Syrians will need an outside humanitarian intervention, maybe just to stay alive. So I think that is imperative. But then additionally, if we do look at kind of colder strategic rationales, either for a continuing investment in humanitarian assistance, something more than that, or kind of stepping out of the way as others, attempt to step in and to invest in kind of Syria broadly, or in government-held Syria in particular. I think that it's not good for the United States, but even more than that, it's not good for many of the United States friends in Europe or in the region to have a Syria that is a really wild humanitarian crisis, right? I mean, this is a force for, not only kind of human suffering, but additionally destabilization that will radiate beyond Syria's borders.
We're at a real transition point in the structure here, though, because when we talk very vaguely about aid to Syria, people who aren't familiar with the details, might think about sort of a traditional aid program. But for much of the period of this war, U.S. aid has gone to rebel-held areas. So when we say aid to Syria, it's really to anti-Assad areas of Syria that are locally controlled by forces that are not on Assad's side. As Daphne mentioned, about a third of the aid was going into government areas, and that's sort of under protest. A lot of it essentially buttresses the regime. But you could understand this aid to be, in a way, part of an extension of the campaign against Assad. Now, the framework has decisively changed in that not only is Assad not going to fall, it seems, but these areas that are not under his control are shrinking. He's reasserting with the help of Russia and Iran, he's reasserting central government control over these areas. So there's no longer either the reality or the fig leaf of saying, well, we're giving aid, U.S. aid, but it's not really going to the Syrian government. As time goes on, it really is going to go to the government. And I think this conversation about aid is really inseparable from the conversation about sort of infinite sanctions and the creation of pariah states, which has been a U.S. modus operandi for decades, and I would argue a really counterproductive one. It was our position towards Saddam's Iraq. It's now our position towards Iran. The sort of idea that you can sort of build an iron wall against some country that's you defined as an enemy country, and then have an infinite and escalating campaign to isolate that country from aid, from the world economy, from diplomacy. And I see the questions about aid to Syria as feeding right into a question of, with Assad having consolidated his power, are we going to move to a grudging readmission of of Syria to without having to embrace it to international sort of modalities, or are we going to try and create around Syria the kind of unending U.S.-backed isolation campaign that we've had against Iran?
Well, just so I think I would dispute that characterization of U.S. aid over the course of the conflict, and I think here let's kind of draw a distinction between humanitarian aid and stabilization assistance. So the humanitarian aid is something that kind of per humanitarian imperatives, and then in line with humanitarian principles, has been supported by the U.S. and others throughout the whole of Syria, whether in areas of government control or areas beyond it, kind of where Damascus has obstructed the delivery of that aid to areas outside its control across the lines of the conflict. Then there's been an exceptional arrangement made per this this UN Security Council resolution that is being that is being reduced in pieces by Russian vetoes that truncated Damascus's sovereign control over its borders, and then allowed UN agencies to support the delivery of humanitarian aid cross-border with only notifications, not permissions, from Damascus. Whereas stabilization aid is something that was over the course of the war going exclusively to areas outside Damascus's control, because stabilization is not this kind of emergency life-saving aid. It is assistance for municipal services, for governance, for civil society. There can be kind of overlaps and complementarities with humanitarian aid. But the aim here is to capacitate a political order. And I think, so that was the idea. It's become less viable over time as many of these areas have, what had been opposition-held enclaves have ceased to exist, or have come under the control of, various, kind of political military forces that don't represent the type of political order that the U.S. can support for various reasons. So I think that kind of the continuation of humanitarian aid, whether kind of via cross-border, either under UN auspices or via NGOs, and then additionally from Damascus, via the UN system. I mean, this would represent kind of the continuation of the status quo, and it's the minimum necessary to keep people alive as part of this emergency response. I think that the question is whether, so that's not efficient. It's not the best way to serve people. It's not a way to create a dignified or sustained way of life for the recipients, the beneficiaries of this aid. And then that's where you see, I think, humanitarians themselves and some others, urge a sort of step change, a graduation from humanitarian aid to, whether you call it stabilization or humanitarian plus or early recovery, some of these things that have humanitarian benefit, but then kind of creep into this stabilization semi-reconstruction space. I think that's what's kind of up for debate here. And then that is what, the U.S. is adamant that should not happen.
Today's world is changing faster than ever. Old rules don't apply, and the new rules haven't been written. At least not yet. I'm Rohan Advani, and I produce the Order from Ashes podcast at the Century Foundation. a leading progressive think tank that promotes peace, cooperation, and equality at home and abroad. On Order from Ashes, we try to make sense of a new international system in which America no longer dictates the global order. Join us as we talk to activists and analysts on the front lines of the most pressing issues in international policy.
Welcome back. You're listening to Order from Ashes. I'm Thanassis Cambanis, and today I'm talking about U.S. aid to Syria with Daphne McCurdy, who used to actually supervise some of the U.S. aid programs in Syria and is now working as an analyst in the United States, and Sam Heller, a Beirut-based analyst who has been following the conflict in Syria in excruciating detail since it began. Thank you both for joining us. Daphne, tell us what, in your view, is the right kind of aid. You know, we just heard a sort of explanation for the different categories and, you know, stabilization instead of just emergency humanitarian. At this juncture, at this new stage, what would you want to see the United States be investing its money and capability in for Syrians?
Yeah. So first of all, Sam, that was a great overview of these rather nuanced distinctions. And I think it's one that even practitioners themselves sometimes get tripped over. So thank you for presenting it so clearly. I would agree with the way Sam laid it out, which is that the humanitarian assistance currently being provided to regime-held areas is really meant to be emergency response. It's supposed to be life-saving and for the short term. And so now that we have almost entered a decade of conflict, I think from just a purely technical standpoint, there are compelling reasons to be thinking about assistance that goes beyond just this emergency response that can provide a more sustainable pathway for ordinary Syrians to get on with their lives and not be dependent on aid. And, you know, I think one thing that's always worth remembering is that prior to the conflict, Syria was a middle-income country. And so the notion that, you know, Syrians are now reliant on cash handouts and humanitarian assistance, I think that that's something that no one ever wants to be reliant on, but I think is particularly jarring and traumatic for Syrians who used to live a upper middle income or middle income lifestyle. So just from a purely technical standpoint, I think it's important for us to, at the very least, start having the conversation, because right now we're not even doing that. Start having that conversation about what assistance that goes beyond emergency relief could look like. Now, we also, obviously, assistance doesn't exist in a vacuum, and you can't think about it without the political ramifications. And this is where I think it gets complicated, particularly at a time, as Sam noted, the regime and the Russians are trying to cut back on avenues for cross-border assistance and find ways to cut off assistance to opposition-held areas. I think politically it would be really damaging to, at this moment, increase the types of assistance we're providing into regime-held Syria without also demanding dramatic changes in the operating environment, because the regime would capitalize on that as a political win. But I do think we need to grapple with the reality that we can't just continue providing emergency assistance, and we need to start thinking through ways that we do expand the types of assistance we're using, while also trying to find ways to leverage our assistance to demand reforms in the assistance paradigm. And that's something that I don't think we, as both the U.S. and Western donors more generally, have done enough of in regime-held areas.
I think it's a bit of a sort of fantasy to, one, we know that this regime is quite skillful at self-preservation and at harnessing international aid for its own good. So it's wishful thinking, in my view, to imagine that a scenario in which the regime somehow relinquishes some of its hard-won and hard reasserted sovereignty in exchange for some kind of aid. And the second thing that I think is wishful thinking, in particular by the United States, is the idea that they can accomplish through the leverage of aid what they couldn't accomplish through outright war and conflict. So in my view, the real options on the table are giving some form of aid that the regime will, in your words, Daphne, use to claim some kind of win, and they will, right? Any kind of Western aid that flows into regime-controlled areas of Syria, no matter how it's framed and articulated, is going to give some amount of legitimacy and political win to the regime. And we're not operating in a vacuum. We're operating in a history where the United States, for its entire existence, has had relationships with problematic states. And there's any number of U.S. aid recipients, whether they received military aid or non-military aid, who were deeply flawed actors, and that's gone out of vogue in the post 9/11 era to be open about this, even though the U.S. has not ever stopped doing this. Aid to Egypt, aid to partners like Iraq, and on to a very long list of troubled actors, and I think that it's really notable in this debate that people who try to work on how to function in that gray area are either accused of being Assad apologists or of somehow undermining U.S. interests, and it seems to me that is actually where the policy exists. It exists in that liminal area, and we're somehow punished for speaking publicly about, how do you do X, Y, and Z in Syria, knowing that, yes, Assad will benefit some, and we really don't like Assad, but also we really don't want to create yet another vacuum for U.S. relationships in a strategically crucial area, and we need to acknowledge that it's actually in the U.S. interest to have relationships with even relatively weak donor recipients and people who are compromised but also willing to cooperate with the U.S. on some limited aid. And I think that is the sort of umbrella of a sort of realistic conversation about U.S. aid.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And a common refrain you hear now in Washington policy circles is that about policy to Syria is that we have to better match means and ends. And when it comes to assistance, I think, Thanassis, your point is absolutely right, that we can't expect assistance to achieve what, a minimal military intervention and other coercive tools has not been able to. And so I think that we need to be intellectually honest about what assistance could provide, and it's very minimal. And to me, what it does provide from a moral standpoint is it makes life marginally better for ordinary Syrians, and it alleviates some of their suffering. And then from a strategic level, I think it allows us to keep relationships with the people of Syria and not fall into the trap that you pointed out, which is that we equate the population of a country with a regime that we do not like. And I think it's taking what I refer to in the paper as a lifeline approach, which is that we recognize that we are able to achieve very little currently, but we keep these relationships and these channels open because we don't know what could happen in the future. And it's helpful for us to have nodes of engagement that go beyond the governments and the regimes of adversarial states.
We'll be back in a minute.
What exactly would a progressive foreign policy look like in the Middle East? What can governments do differently and better? Critiques are easy. Providing realistic policy proposals is harder. I'm Michael Wahid Hanna, and with my colleagues and collaborators here at the Century Foundation, we're trying to answer the hard policy questions with specific, concrete proposals. You can see our ideas and join the conversation at our website, tcf.org.
You're listening to Order from Ashes, the International Affairs podcast from the Century Foundation. I'm Thanassis Cambanis, and I've got Daphne McCurdy and Sam Heller on the WhatsApp. Thank you both for being on the podcast. I want to turn now to the question of sanctions and the sanctions context for this discussion of U.S. aid. Can you, maybe, Sam, you want to take this first? Can you tell us how the recently passed Caesar Act constrains or shapes the environment for U.S. activities in Syria, and also what is the sort of cascading possibility of other sanctions that are on the table?
I mean, I think we can talk about the provision of U.S. or U.S. support for humanitarian aid inside Syria, the kind of this notional investment in something more than that, whether kind of stabilization or fuller reconstruction, or kind of disengagement, a choice to not to act, not to be involved. But I think that if we're talking about some of the main ways that the U.S. is now involved in Syria, it's not just in terms of what it is or isn't doing. It's also in terms of what it is actively discouraging others from doing. So this is, I think, one of the key U.S. interventions in the Syrian scene currently. And then
what is this? Is this U.S. pressure stopping European countries from doing more long-term rebuilding aid? Is that the kind of thing we have in mind here?
Well, I think that let's see. So there are sanctions, which it sounds like certainly after the passage of the Caesar Act, are many and intimidating. They are extraterritorial. They apply to non-American persons. And then, seem likely to kind of additionally dissuade non-Americans from investing in sectors like oil and gas, like the reconstruction of this destroyed country, or in any sort of transaction deal that might somehow bring them into contact with like the Syrian state and its institutions. So that is part of it, but then it is additionally linked to a really, vigorous campaign of political pressure to, discourage countries that might otherwise, view it as kind of beneficial in interested terms or in humanitarian terms. To invest in what is now partially a post-conflict Syria. So that includes regional states who are inclined to reopen to Damascus and then to the kind of majority of Syrian people that are under the Syrian government's control, as well as a lot of the private economic actors that, absent this kind of sanctions chill, this intimidation, might be the ones to actually, do much of the rebuilding of the country at like a kind of a smaller, more specific level. And then this is something the demarches that the U.S. State Department has sent out. I mean, they haven't been shy about it. I remember there was one instance in which there was a hiccup in U.S.-Armenian relations because the Armenians had assented to a Russian request to send a team of medics to, I think, Aleppo, which has a substantial Syrian-Armenian population. And then they were blindsided by what was, an extremely vigorous and negative U.S. reaction. And then this, is part of a relationship that has very little to do with Syria, that has many other, aspects to it. And then it's that kind of pressure and, even bordering on intimidation that's been brought to bear on many countries, including regionals who are, one or two borders removed from Syria, and then who do not want to see this place continue to be impoverished and dangerous. But with U.S. policy the way it is, I think have few options.
Well, and Daphne, when you think about let's say there's a Biden administration reevaluating Syria policy in 6 months' time, are the options you recommend in this paper going to be executable in light of the Caesar Act and the other sanctions that are out there? Are these like legally permitted, or would there have to be some kind of modification or rollback of the sanctions regimen to have even these sort of modest and symbolic kinds of aid partnerships that you propose?
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of strictly legal terms, this sort of work should still be possible even with a sanctions regime in place for two reasons. One, there is a humanitarian waiver in place with all sanctions to Syria to allow humanitarian work. So when we talk about things like humanitarian plus or early recovery work, because that still falls under the humanitarian rubric, you could still technically do it. And then some of the other sorts of work that I think would fall more in the stabilization bucket, like supporting civil society or supporting very local groups to do social cohesion work, for example, because that would not in any way benefit the regime, it is still technically possible to do it, even with sanctions in place. Now, the problem is that even with this humanitarian waiver in place, there is an issue of what some call overcompliance, where the paperwork required is so onerous and burdensome to demonstrate that what you are doing is indeed within the confines of the legislation, that people and entities just opt out of doing any of this work in the first place. And so I think, one thing that would need to change is just in terms of the rhetoric, just making it clear that this is the type of work that would be welcomed under a new administration. I think that would go a long way because, as Sam noted earlier, this administration has been very clear that it is vehemently opposed to anything that goes beyond emergency humanitarian assistance.
There's a sort of conceptual shift that I think is really necessary, which is that the U.S. ought to move away from its obsession with regime change and regime behavior change and move more in the direction of containing outcomes it doesn't want. So, instead of trying to make the Syrian regime behave in a certain way or the Iranian regime behave in a certain way, it can spend its energy, let's say, containing the fallout of regional militia actors or this humanitarian spillover, and remove this whole set of practices that are based on what is, ultimately, wherever you fall on it, a unworkable goal of forcing hostile regimes to change their behavior under duress. And I do think of Syria as a major test case. I mean, we have in the region two different paradigms for sort of long-term U.S. relations. One being Lebanon, where reluctantly, maybe, and with some problems, the U.S. continues to have a lot of relationships institutionally with a state that is dominated by, but not wholly synonymous to Hezbollah. And the other extreme is Iran, where not only does the U.S. try to isolate every actor within Iran, it will target and assassinate Iranian officials in U.S.-friendly countries, and it pressures third countries to do to sort of minimize or or minimize involvement or take active part in these isolating strategies. And my concern is that politically, any new administration in the U.S. Will just find it easier to continue on this path than to be a regime, an administration that looks like it's rolling back sanctions against war criminals, which ultimately the Caesar sanctions are trying to punish genuine war criminals. And, hopefully nobody's in favor of rewarding war criminals. And that structure, I think, makes it a political no-win for people who want to find ways to engage Syria. Do you two want to end on some thoughts about how to square that conundrum and how to find ways to engage a Syria that is for the foreseeable future going to continue to be ruled by the Assad family?
Yeah, well, if I can say, so I would emphasize that U.S. policy currently, even as it has moved away from the support that was provided covertly and overtly previously to the armed insurgency against the Syrian state, it is nonetheless still a policy of intervention that is aimed at regime change. I don't think that we should kind of fool ourselves into thinking otherwise. And then certainly the language that we hear now from U.S. officials about seeking changes in behavior instead of changes in regime is fantastical. It is non-credible. This is a policy that through kind of non-military means, again, primarily these economic and political tools, aims to topple the Syrian regime or to, kind of make it so burdensome on its Russian ally that, that Russia will somehow intervene to dislodge it. So it's an interventionist policy, even if it, even under a maintenance of the status quo into a new administration. And it is one that I think is, arguably actively destabilizing for Syria and for the region. It's something that again is going to kind of send shockwaves outward, including into U.S. friends like Jordan. And I think that part of the problem here, though, is that the U.S. bears very few of the costs because we are. We as the United States, not me physically. I am next door to Syria. I'm in Lebanon, but
we don't hold you responsible for U.S. policy, Sam.
Well, certainly not. Not under with these people. But no, the United States is on the other side of an ocean. So it feels very few of the destabilizing consequences of Syria's war. Whereas, many of the U.S.'s most important allies, including in Europe, including in the region, for them, this is very immediate. They are, intensely, maybe existentially affected by, what is happening in Syria, and by a policy of political and economic strangulation that I think for Americans, it's probably pretty easy to just kind of put on autopilot or to maintain for these sort of symbolic, emotive ends, regardless of what it achieves practically.
Daphne, closing thoughts on how to square our practical aims with our moral values?
Yeah, well, I agree with Sam that I think despite the rhetoric, the current policy is one of, even though we call it behavior change, it is behavior change that is so existential that it effectively amounts to regime change. And the fact is that the current policy is not working. The status quo is unsustainable. And on the current trajectory, Syria will continue to be a failed state that continues to destabilize its neighbors. And so I think the way we square the circle in a new administration is to say, we need to move beyond what I see as like a very polarized debate when it comes to Syria. It's either regime change or complete disengagement. And is there something in the middle that we can do to achieve a much more limited set of outcomes that still advance U.S. interests of bringing stability to this country while also alleviating human suffering? And I think that begins with a paradigm shift of recognizing that the Assad regime is staying in power, and what are the ways that we can extract the minimal tools of leverage we have, because we don't have maximal tools here, to get a limited set of wins, whether they are ways to improve the aid paradigm, or they're ways to ensure that the UN Commissioner for Refugees can enter the country and help protect returnees. I think we need to be thinking much more minimally, given the minimal tools that we have at our disposal.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I mean, I'm someone who has really changed over time in my view of what's possible and what we should focus on. And I think there was a time to really prioritize human rights and the desire of people who wanted to be free of Bashar al-Assad's rule, and that didn't work out. And we can't just cling to our 2016 views in 2020. And I really hope that other people, decision makers in Washington and Europe and the region are able to adjust. Daphne, McCurdy, and Sam Heller, thank you both so much for coming on Order from Ashes, the Century Foundation's International Affairs podcast, and I really enjoyed your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us on.
Thanks. It was great just chatting with you, Thanassis and Sam.
You've been listening to Order from Ashes, the International Affairs podcast from the Century Foundation. If you've enjoyed what you heard, please rate us and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. It'll make it easier for other listeners to find us and help us to keep producing these conversations. Thanks for listening. Till next time.